Hello and welcome to the Sixth Pillar podcast, hosted by Chief Neil Gang and proudly produced by Techne Innovations. I'm Shalyn Finstad, CXO at Techne Innovations, and for today's episode, I'm honored to introduce you to our very special guest, Dr. Phil Baquie. Originally from Australia, Phil Baquie is a mental health professional with extensive experience in law enforcement and military settings. He has trained elite units like the Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and various federal law enforcement agencies. Phil holds a master's degree in counseling and a doctorate in psychology, and he's also a law enforcement firearms instructor and trained hostage negotiator. As the founder and CEO of Alpha 6 Tactical Solutions, Phil leads a private security contracting and training company while also managing a large mental health practice, dedicating most of his time to consulting and training first responders and military personnel. Dr. Phil Baquie, welcome to the Sixth Pillar podcast. Chief Gang, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Shalyn. That was a great introduction of our next guest. Welcome to the Sixth Pillar podcast. I'd like to thank the team at the Techne Innovations, our technical director and producer, Matt Krell, and our executive experience officer, Shalyn. I do want to talk a little bit about Techne Innovations. They provide integrated media solutions, mobile app development, podcasting, branding, social media support, and book publishing. So if you're out there and you're starting off and you're just trying to make a social media presence, reach out to them. They're an amazing team. They actually brought my 3-year dream to reality. So reach out to them. They're amazing to work with. So welcome to the Sixth Pillar podcast. Welcome to our family. We have unfiltered conversations about leadership and organizational wellness, absent of buzzwords and BS. People always ask, where did the sixth pillar come from? Well, the sixth pillar is part of the 21st century policing model. And the sixth pillar, as you may know, is officer wellness and resiliency. So what a better title, what a better name that really talks about the things that we talk about here, organizational wellness and leadership. As everybody knows, and my family should know, that we start everything off with a Bible verse. And today, this is so applicable to our guest that we have today. It's out of 1 Peter 4:10. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in various forms. And I have a second verse that is applicable to this as well. It's out of Philippians 2:3. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. And this gentleman that we're going to bring on today is doing that. He's putting himself above others. He's helping out first responders in the military community. I just couldn't be more happy to bring together Dr. Phil Baquie and his tactical resiliency, where he's preparing the mind to win the fight. Again, preparing the mind to win the fight. See, in our profession, we are so used to responding and doing something after something happens. Dr. Phil is going to bring a new concept to us, and we're going to learn some tangible takeaways that could help all our first responders, and including you, the executive officers in your organizations. So, Dr. Phil, thank you so much for being with us.
So glad to be here, Chief. Thanks for having us.
No, it's great. Talk a little bit about, I like when we talk about tangible takeaways, but it's always good to know who we are and who you are. I think people need to know a little bit about your journey, because I did spend some time with Dr. Phil down in Hagerstown when we were both speaking at the same event for PTSD 911 with Conrad Weaver. And I really got to know this individual. And not only is he so intelligent, but such a humble man and just a great dynamic person. I learned a lot, and I went away from this journey with him a better person. So how did this journey for you start, like working with first responders in the military?
So hearing my voice, you might think, well, where's this turkey from? So I live in the southeast of the US. And when I often will say, when people say, where are you from? I'll say Southern Alabama, just out of a joke. But I'm actually originally from Australia. So that's what this accent is that you're hearing. I moved over here to the US on the 15th of April in 1999. So a few years back. Always wanted to move to America from Australia. It always been a dream to do that. And I got the opportunity to fulfill that dream. Early on, I was actually in the music industry. I was a professional musician for quite a while. And having the opportunity to literally live out my dreams as a kid of always wanting to come to the US, I got the opportunity and the privilege to do many of the things I'd only ever dreamed of as a kid. And it was an absolute thrill. During that time, I came to a place of realizing that, America has given me so much. and the privilege of being able to literally live my dreams. So I felt a duty and an obligation to give back to the country that's given me so much. And so I did. I joined the military, and that's how I got my citizenship. So I got my citizenship through doing that as a US citizen. And so that began that process. And I did join a little later in life. So I signed up in my early 30s, I was the old man in my first platoon, in my first company. When I was in my early 30s, I'd sort of come to a place of looking and seeing, well, what are the things that I want to do in my life? I didn't want to get to the end of my life, should I get the privilege of living a long, natural life. I didn't want to get to the end and look back and have any regrets for my choices and the things that I did. And so I thought in my early 30s, well, when I was 33, actually, I thought, well, Jesus died and saved the world when he was my age, so I felt the pressure. It's like, what am I going to do here to make sure that I make an impact on this world? And so I made a list of things that I always wanted to do that I'd never done. A couple of them were, finish my black belt in martial arts, which I had quit when I was 17, and I always regretted that. So I went back and knocked that out. I got my black belt in the mixed martial art. And then I'd always wanted to join the military, and I got the privilege of doing that. I'd always wanted to be a police officer, much like my hero brother, who I love very much. So I had the privilege to do that for a little while. I also wanted to go back to school. And so I had the privilege of being able to do that too. So I was able to go back, and I actually got a degree in theology, and then moved on and got a degree in professional counseling, my master's, and my doctorate of psychology. But I've had the privilege of being able to do those things and then incorporate all of them together in what I'm doing now with the Tactical Resilience and the nonprofit that I have called the Warrior Resilience Project. And so now I get the privilege of being able to work with my brothers and sisters in both the military setting and also a law enforcement and first responder setting, and helping with wellness and helping with reducing stress and providing tools and techniques to be able to be a force multiplier in their environment.
That is one of the reasons why you're so impressive. Just there's so many different avenues that you can pull from to help. Sometimes it's dealing with the mental health professionals. It's a lack of understanding and perception, right? The buzzword now is culturally competent, but I'm not sure if there's anybody out there that can be more culturally competent than the ones that have been police officers, such as yourself, and now in the military. So super blessed to have you. And I know that we're going to have a lot of tangible takeaways for our people. One thing that struck me as funny is when you would tell people that you're from Mississippi, and they're like, oh, that's where that accent's from, right? But I remember a funny story when we were lifting over to the event where you said people having a hard time hearing you on the radio and understanding you. Could you share that with the audience a little bit?
Yeah, that was pretty challenging. So I was just a short time at an agency in Mississippi, just on the edge of the Mississippi Delta. And so the accent on both sides of the fence were very interesting. We had a hard time understanding each other, me on the radio with them and them on the radio with me. So I'd have to try to purposely put on an American accent when I spoke on the radio, just so that they could understand me. It was kind of a pretty comical situation. Would have been a great reality TV show, that's for sure.
Well, yeah. And of course, a little humor to the podcast is always enjoyable. But talk a little bit about you as a psychologist in this profession. What are the contemporary issues that you're seeing? What are you seeing from the first responders? What are some of the things that you're treating now, or you're trying to help first responders work through? Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, sure. So I had my license as a licensed professional counselor for about 10 years or so. Now what I'm doing is primarily focusing on coaching. So that gives me the privilege of being able to not have to be bound by any of the requirements as a mental health professional from a licensure perspective. So it really gives me the opportunity to be able to spend time and dig in deep with guys in a way that probably a standard mental health professional isn't able to do. And so I find that that's also really great because there's a lot of stigma around mental health professionals. So being able to sort of come alongside someone as a coach, I call myself a cognitive performance coach, for example. So that's I think a little more sexy for a first responder than going to see a shrink. I have the pedigree and the background and the experience of that, but being able to just be able to get alongside, a fellow first responder without any of those tags, I do find a little helpful. That's sort of been a real neat development that I've been able to utilize.
So talk about What are some of the contemporary issues? What are police officers facing? I know we talk about the trauma, a number of about 188 average traumatic events that an average officer will see when they come to you and they say, Dr. Phil, having difficulties. What areas you're seeing prevalent? My guess would be sleep deprivation would be one, alcohol abuse maybe another. What are you seeing and what can you share with us?
Yeah, so definitely when someone comes in, because primarily now I only work with first responders and military, mainly in the high performing area with special operations and then SWAT. Yeah, that's sort of my area of focus and expertise now. But the biggest thing, so sleep, you highlighted that, and that's definitely, I think, one of the biggest issues. And of course, as you're aware, I'm sure, and many of the listeners are aware, that is really consistent with someone who's got the symptoms of PTSD or PTSI. One of the biggest ones is I'm having problems sleeping. That's usually one of my first questions. Tell me about your sleep, tell me about your exercise, and tell me about your nutrition. Because I find they're the three areas that we suffer in the most. And honestly, I think that nailing those three areas of nutrition, sleep, and exercise actually takes care of the vast majority of the mental health issues that we see in the first responder in the military world.
Hey, do me a favor, repeat that one more time, because I think that's a big message to our listeners, because I've consistently said it's okay to be okay. It's okay to have self-care. It's okay to don't follow as though the victim narrative that you can't do anything about these situations we're in. So if you could repeat that one more time, I think that'd be really important.
Yeah. So basically I was saying like good quality sleep, 7 to 8 hours a night, if that's possible, along with good nutrition and good exercise 3 to 4 times a week, if possible, really does take care of the majority of the mental health issues and struggles that we face and that we see in the first responder world and the military world and across the board for anyone, really. So I'll be dead honest with you, like folks that might come in for talk therapy, let's say, don't necessarily need it, or going to a shrink to get prescribed medication. And I'm certainly not saying if you need to be on a medication, don't be on it. Absolutely. If that's what your medical professional is prescribing and advising, you need to do what they say. But looking at how overwhelmingly the amount of meds that are dished out today in the medical world, and even from a talk therapy perspective, the amount of times I have guys that come to me and say, I've gone to multiple therapists and I don't feel any different. Nothing's happening. That isn't necessarily to me the first thing you need, the first intervention, either from a pharmacological perspective with prescription medications or necessarily with talk therapy. I think that if we can look at those three pillars right there of nutrition, exercise, and also sleep, that really resolves a vast majority of the struggles and the problems that we see coming up. Now, not always, and absolutely, I think there is a need for medical intervention from a pharmacological perspective at times. And of course, talk therapy can be very helpful, but it's kind of an odd thing perhaps to hear from someone with a background in mental health to say maybe seeing a shrink or going to a therapist isn't necessarily the first step. But it's not. And quite honestly, I think, as I said, a lot of these things can be resolved just through a basic healthy lifestyle.
Well, I think I applaud your honesty, because there are some mental health professionals that are on there. They understand this is a big issue in the profession and they're trying to make money and that's what they do. But I think it takes courage for someone like you to share that from your profession. So thank you. I do want to talk a little bit about sleep deprivation. It was something that I spoke to at a previous podcast with Lieutenant Grossman, and we talked a little about some strategies. And one of the things was just understanding that you limit blue light exposure before you go to sleep, stop your gaming before you go to sleep, put those tablets in, put your Candy Crush down and make sure you're getting good sleep. But there's something I think that I actually hand out when I present. It's called the MZ100 eye mask, something I never thought that I even try with an eye mask, yet it works. There's been studies done that a small amount of light alone in a room can have somebody awoken from their slumber. So there was a study done and they put somebody in a dark room and they just left the light on in the bathroom. So the light underneath the door was enough to disrupt their sleep. So that's important to understand that. And then there was another study done where they used as a total dark room. They put a subject in a room and they just shined a pen light on their calf and it actually woke them up and it disrupted their sleep. So completely dark room is important. Then there's other things like wearables, like the Whoop and the Aura Ring that can help you understand and start tracking your sleep. I'm not going to make this a sleep episode, but I think it's really important that it is one of the critical issues facing our profession, and not many people are talking about it or proactively giving you solutions to be able to change those outcomes. And you have the ability to do that, like Dr. Phil just said. You talked in a previous podcast about how law enforcement trauma is actually more acute than the military. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think there's still some people in our profession that don't understand the impact of trauma in this profession.
Yeah, well, you highlighted that earlier with one of the statistics that you quoted. So the average law enforcement officer, this was taken from a study that was with mid-size agencies. The average officer in a mid-size agency over the span of their career were engaged in 188 critical incidences. And so when we look at that compared to a civilian, the average of 1 to 5 for a lifetime, it is consistent that for first responders, especially, the prevalency of being exposed to critical incidences is so much higher. And I would say probably more so than the military, because usually with the military, even in the special operations world, you've got very compartmentalized moments of either combat or operations that even if you're on a deployment, the soft world usually have a shorter level of deployments than, say, the big army. But even with that, you've got very selected and specific and targeted time periods of actually engaging in what could potentially be critical incidences, which increases the risk of being exposed to traumatic events. Now, when we look at that versus law enforcement, let's say, for a police officer, you never know, because you're working your shifts throughout the month, an average of 14, 15 days a month for an average law enforcement officer. You never know what every single day, you never know what every single call is going to be. And so the exposure rate is much higher because it's just so much more consistent on an ongoing basis versus, for example, in special operations where you've got very select and poignant times of operations. Yeah, it's ongoing and it's never ending because you never know. For the military, they can prepare their mind for what they're going in to do. But for a law enforcement officer, it's every day. And you never know what their next call is going to be, as you're fully aware of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The demographics of this show is a lot of police and fire executives. What comes with that? It comes with that electronic leash that 24/7, we have that cell phone by our side. Many of us have 2 cell phones. Then we talk about the negative consequences of hypervigilance. So are there tips for the executives who are on call 24/7? As a police chief, we don't have a chance. We don't have the opportunity to go, but I'm going to put my phone aside. So as long as you're sitting in that chair as a police chief, you're on call. And we even have our detectives on call. So I know there's not a great solution for this profession in that, but we have to try to understand that our people are hypervigilant 24/7. What can we do? And maybe where can we at least take baby steps to help improve in that area? Do you have any suggestions?
Absolutely. I think the first one is to reverse engineer your life. So, for example, you're getting ready for retirement soon, right? You're coming up on that point for your age and for where you are in life of being able to look at that as being a possibility for you. So at some point, everyone listening to this podcast right now is going to take a badge off and is going to take a gun off. That's inevitable at some point, whether that's in the next year or the next 5 or the next 15 years. At some point, you're no longer going to be a cop. You're no longer going to be an executive. You're no longer going to be a chief. So who are you going to be? And what do you want your life to look like? And we see from the stats, it's overwhelming that, as you're aware, the average law enforcement age of retirement currently, and these stats maybe need to be adjusted from the last couple of years, but the average age of retirement is around 62. And horrifically, the average age of death of a law enforcement officer, depending on which study you look at, is between 57 and 62. And so what we see there is a couple of things. One, a horrible recruitment tool for new officers of saying, hey, when you sign up to be a cop or when you sign up to be a first responder, you can probably knock 20 years off your life from a statistical perspective. That's horrible, right?
We'll keep that off the recruitment flyers. Yeah.
What that highlights to me is that when you get to that age of retirement, who are you going to be? And I remember recently doing a training for, it was a state police chiefs association. So there was hundreds of chiefs in the room that I was training. I said, okay, put up your hand if you know of someone who's retired and within a couple of years died. Every single hand in the room went up. Every single hand. We know that happens. To me, the big question is, well, what's going on there? Why is that happening? And I believe it's because there's a lack of ability to have balance in life. So when you talk about, well, what are some good tips to help with the executive that's always on and never gets it off? I think it is to find some ways to compartmentalize who you are and what you're doing through primarily, I think, having good opportunities to invest in areas of interest outside of your profession. And you've seen this as well, that the longer someone is law enforcement or the first responding world, there's definitely a decrease in engagement with socializing, with life outside of what we're doing from a professional perspective, because it's all encompassing and engrossing. It's a lifestyle. It's not a job for many. And unfortunately, as the saying goes, you might love the job, but the job doesn't love you back. Realizing that I have to be proactive about who I am and what I'm doing. So from when I say reverse engineering, what I'm meaning is to look at who is it that I want to be when I retire? What do I want my life to look like when I'm done with this crazy roller coaster ride of a profession that I'm doing? I think by very purposely and intentionally creating opportunities to invest in areas outside of the profession, for example, hobbies. And that's one of the biggest things that I see is a lack of engagement and a lack of the ability for an officer to be able to really dig in deep to other areas of interest outside their profession. And that's another question that I'll often ask is like, well, what are you guys doing for your off time? When you get it, what sort of ways are you purposely investing in self-care? Generally speaking, I promise you, I haven't seen a study on this yet, but it would make a really interesting one, is to look at officers that die when they retire. And quite often you hear it all of the time within a year or two, someone retiring out of law enforcement, they die. Heart attack is probably the main common cause. Is to look, well, why? What's going on there? And I promise you that if you would see that consistently those that tend to have a lower lifespan in the profession of law enforcement haven't diversified who they are outside of their profession. The stress levels of what's engaged from a professional perspective as an executive in law enforcement finally catch up with you. So I think that's one of the biggest things. So to reverse engineer it would look like, okay, where are my hobbies? And if I don't have hobbies, I'm like, well, the next step would be to, well, what can I do to create areas of interest? I think curiosity is a big thing there. If you're not sure of things that interest you in your life, is to go, well, what am I curious about? Where are some areas that I can develop here? And then reverse engineering it from there. For example, if you love woodworking, I've heard this one a lot. Well, I just love this, but I just don't have the time to do it. Well, why not? You can still create time. Even if you've got to be on call, it doesn't mean that you can't be investing in your hobbies or investing in other things outside of your profession. And if you got to take a call, you got to take a call. But just even small amounts of time of being able to invest in areas of interest and areas of passion and areas of curiosity that have nothing to do with your profession as a law enforcement officer, I think goes a long way to help reverse engineer who it is that I want to be once my garment and my badge is off my hip.
Great points. I think that's something that's under discussed and maybe under taught. It is retirement, right? It's a thing, right? Preparing for retirement's a thing. I don't have clear numbers in front of me, but I know that there's a large number of officers who also die by suicide once they retire. Mm-hmm. See, our profession, I think, has done a little bit of an injustice to all of us as we started, because you come into the academy and you're 20 something years old and you're pissing fire and vinegar and they're telling you, you are a police officer, you are a police officer, you are a police officer. You hear that throughout your entire career, but the bottom line, it's not who we are. That's not who we are, right? That's what we do for a living. And that we have to change that message, because as people are leaving the profession, when they take that badge off, they take that uniform off, they now are losing their identity. And I think it's really important, the facts that you brought about re-engineering. Dr. Kevin Gilmorton talks about the ustas. Well, I used to go biking and I used to work out and I used to go fishing. It's really important that, especially near the end of our careers, that we understand self-care, that we institute some self-care initiatives in our own lives and understand the oxygen mask theory, right? We have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before we can help others. So the same thing here, self-care. We got to pour out into ourselves before we ever could pour out into other people. Really important as we're getting ready to retire, that those things, that we understand those. Again, we can leave here healthy. The poor narrative that everybody's going to walk out limping and injured and mentally screwed up is a bad narrative. I changed that narrative. It's okay to be okay. It's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to get blood work done yearly. It's okay to seek mental health professional assistance, a coach like yourself. It's okay to do those things so you are healthy. Why? Because your family deserves it. And so do you, because you put 30 years into this career. We deserve to live happy lives and start collecting that retirement that we paid into for so many years. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that was a really important component that we spoke about today. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Something I think it really speaks into as well is too often our whys are too little. So Friedrich Nietzsche, I believe a German philosopher, once said that he that has a why can endure any how. So if my why is bigger than my how, the execution of my life or the problems or the difficulties that I face, if my reason, if my meaning, if my why for who I am and what I do is bigger than that, then I can usually get through whatever the struggles and the difficulties are. But too often we have little whys. Like my reason and my purpose and my motivation can be overwhelmed due to a lack of resources or to a lack of focus, or like I mentioned before, a lack of reverse engineering of my life, to get to the point where I get so absorbed in my profession, I get so absorbed with my identity, as you said, in what I do, not who I am, that my profession becomes my identity. That's why, once again, hitting on what you mentioned before, why we see an increased rate of suicide amongst retired law enforcement officers is because their sense of meaning is diminished. Their sense of why for who they are and what they do is less challenged. And unfortunately, you get hit with a dark night of the soul or a bout of depression or a struggle to find a sense of meaning in who you are now that you're no longer doing the thing that you've always loved for so many years. And without that bigger sense of purpose within who I am, then I'm left wanting and falling short of my value for who I am as a human being. So this stuff is super important. You're right. This needs to be taught early on. It's not just something for those that are facing retirement or getting to the end of their career. If we can get in on the front end of this with officers from the beginning on the ground up and permeate it throughout the career and throughout the culture of law enforcement, I think we can see a reverse and a change to this.
I agree. Thank you. I know a lot of listeners are probably not going to be happy with this next subject, but you speak about alcohol, alcohol being an inhibitor. Let's talk a little bit about that because I think it's really important. Very prevalent still in our profession. In fact, I bet there's listeners right now going, oh shit, I better put this beer down, right? Let's talk a little bit about it. I think we have to talk about it. I think it's important that people understand so they can make informed decisions, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't drink, we shouldn't do that. It's just being informed about the decisions that we're making can help us have better outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think alcohol as a coping mechanism absolutely works. That's why people turn to it. And that's why people use it so often. Definitely within our culture of law enforcement, it's an acceptable coping mechanism that is used and often joked about, slapped on the back and having a drink. And it works until it doesn't work. And that's the problem with it, is that from a personal perspective, I mean, I don't have a problem having a beer now and then. I enjoy that, especially even more so with a friend or a colleague, being able to sit back and crack open a cold one is great. But if it is something that I'm turning to when my stress levels are elevated or my anxiety is increased or my depression is kicking in, then it's something that is probably not ultimately going to be helpful, because the truth of it is, for the majority of people that develop a substance use disorder, such as alcohol use, it's something that takes practice. It's debatable for some folks who consider alcoholism as a disease that you can't help and you can't control. I want to respect that. But the reality of it is it's a disciplined practice like anything else. It takes practice to become an addict. So really just being able to look and have some level of self-awareness around, okay, am I controlling this or is this controlling me? Is this my go-to when I'm getting stressed or when I feel I need to relax? Am I capable of being able to have an okay time without a few drinks in me? These are things that I think is healthy to ask ourselves and to challenge ourselves on. An easy way to do that is a little litmus test of like, well, okay, I tend to always have a beer when I get off work or whatever. It's like, okay, well, maybe tonight I won't do that. And can I do that? So just being able to have a look and see if this is an area of self-control that I can develop. Because it's interesting, as cops, the number one word that I see consistently coming up time and time again is the word control. It's an important word for police officers. One, in your job as a profession, you need to maintain control of your environment in order, from a safety perspective for yourself and other officers in the community. But also in our personal lives, seeing the way control is an important element within who I am. And unfortunately, we also see quite often, you hear the horror stories of officers who end up going through horrible divorces. Usually, quite often, the significant other will say, oh yeah, they were so controlling. So realizing that control has a positive, but it also has a negative. If I've got an area in my life that I'm not getting control over, then it's controlling me. Even being able to see alcohol from that perspective of like, okay, if I can have a drink, great, but do I know where the line is? For me personally, for example, I tend to not go over 3. So that's just a personal thing. So usually after about 2 or 3 beers or whatever, it's like, okay, that's enough. I'm good. I don't need any more. If I'm out and about or if I'm with friends, then maybe I'll go to water, I'll go to salsa or something that's got that carbonation and that enjoyable feel on the back of the throat, but that isn't alcoholic. That's mainly because, once again, control. And I don't like being out of control in my environment. That's to me why alcohol is something that I try to maintain control of. I don't want it to control me, and I don't want to get into a place where I feel an inability to be in control of my cognition and my ability to function. And so that's a little positive spin on it from the perspective from an alcohol use point of view, is just being able to look, okay, if there's nothing wrong with having a few beers from my value perspective, okay, well, where can I make sure that I'm maintaining some vigilance around that and some self-awareness? And I think that's usually when we get ourselves into trouble, is that when it becomes a default, we push into it because I'm stressed or because I need to relax or whatever it is. And then it becomes a negative coping mechanism if it begins to become something that's affecting my ability to function, both from a social perspective and then also in a relational perspective, and heaven forbid, a professional perspective. And I've certainly worked with officers where agencies have brought them to me because of alcohol use disorder on the job, which is obviously at that point, yeah, that's creating major issues. But it is something I believe that the vast majority of us can get a hold of. Of course, there's a few within our population that it's a real struggle. And from an alcohol use disorder, that's where we really see issues. But once again, I think that's a practiced coping mechanism that takes discipline to become an alcoholic.
I got you. Well, makes sense. We spent a lot of time talking about different things. I want to get to this next concept because this is really a unique concept, and it's something that you termed left of bang, right? Speak to that concept and why it's such a critical concept is just so important in changing perspectives. Our profession is so reactive, and just the importance of being proactive, and a word that you coined called resiliency. So talk a little bit about those two things. Let's really hopefully change the mindset of some of the listeners and understand that we can get in front of these things if we're intentional.
Yeah, good word. Good choice of word there. Yeah, so the left of bang idea, that's not an original idea with me. That comes out of military terms. Quite often in the special operations world, it's used in regards to if bang is the mission, the firefight, the critical incident, let's say in law enforcement, then right of bang is primarily where we focus on, especially in law enforcement, which is the after action reviews, the critical incident response teams, the mopping up the messes after they've happened. And we definitely need those. They're valuable and important, and every agency should have a strategy and a plan and peer-to-peer support available for officers that are struggling post-event. That would be right of bang if bang is the critical incident. So the work that I do primarily focuses on, as you said, left of bang. Logic would reason that would mean, okay, prior to a critical incident. I see this is where the vast majority of the lack of training takes place in law enforcement, is that there's very little preemptive and proactive training for officers. Most of it is reactive, as you mentioned, dealing with cleaning up a mess after it's happened, rather than going, okay, what can we do to actually prevent this on the front end? So that's where the idea of resiliency comes from, because wellness and resiliency, they're two big buzzwords in law enforcement at the moment, wellness and resiliency training. And that's good. I'm glad that that's the case. I was sitting in a training with the National Academy, FBI, on resiliency. And they've got a great program. It's a trainer program, 40-hour program to train officers and executives in resiliency for mental health and wellness. And it, as I mentioned, a great training. But as I was sitting in it, I was thinking, man, this is good. The resiliency is good. We need this. But as I mentioned before, it's reactive. We need proactive solutions. And so sitting in that training is where I came up with the concept of pre-resiliency rather than resiliency. Little spin on words, but I think it's much deeper than that and speaks to the heart of the need that we have in this profession to really look at, well, how can we be proactive and preactive in how we are approaching critical incidences within our departments and agencies. The idea is to get ahead of the critical incidences or get ahead of the bang on the left side of it to provide some tools and resources. Because when you look at the very nature of what, for example, PTSD is, it's where my ability to interact with my environment is overwhelmed and I don't have the resources available for me to be able to deal with whatever that critical incident is that may or may not turn into a traumatic event for me. The tools and the resources are the things that we need to provide our officers on the front end of things. And I think this starts from a DNA perspective, even as early as the academies. The average, from my research, the average law enforcement academy has maybe 4 hours, at the most 8 hours of any kind of mental health training, dealing with providing tools and resources to our officers. Out of a 10 to 16 week training program for a basic academy, 4 hours is probably the national average. And even then with that, most of that is death by PowerPoint provided by an instructor who's got no clue what they're talking about, or even worse, a mental health professional that's a wet noodle and doesn't know how to relate to an officer coming in, giving sort of, in a way, irrelevant information through death by PowerPoints. I think that this is where we fall short on. And this is the area where I'm passionate about bringing education, awareness, resources, and tools to agencies and to executives in the agencies who are the gatekeepers to be able to provide impact and be the change makers and the trailblazers in the way in which these things can be implemented.
I think you bring up great points. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done with academies, bringing these type of instruction and how to set expectations for the young officers is going to help and change outcomes later on. A couple other things, like what is one of the most critical aspects of policing? It's listening. Where in the academy do we teach people how to listen, right? Or how to actively listen? We don't teach them that. We drive every day, almost 10 hours out of our 12-hour shifts. When do we recertify in driving? Every 2 years. So the things we do most often seems that we have the least amount of training in the academy. And I do agree that this has to be part of academy training then, not just then, but throughout, right? It has to come every so often too, as recertifications and all those other things that we go through throughout our careers. So it's not just a one and done, that we continue to educate the employees. We continue to educate our brothers and sisters. So when they do retire, this is not an issue, that they're already setting their resiliency levels and they know how to address those type things. So when you talk about that, getting out in front of these things, we have a few minutes left. Can you talk a little bit about like, what are some of those things? I think you talk about breath work a little bit, maybe meditation. What can we give? Maybe just a few tangibles so people could start researching, maybe not learn completely from Dr. Phil today, but maybe some things they could start tiptoeing into.
Well, I think in a bigger picture, a real quick overview of, I think, the areas that we need to focus on to look at when for example, a critical incident doesn't necessarily have to become a traumatic event, which causes post-traumatic stress. And of course, as you're aware, and all of our listeners are aware here, that is really probably the biggest issue in law enforcement and the biggest killer of law enforcement officers is stress at the end of the day. But look at the way in which a critical incident that is experienced turns into a traumatic event through not the actual critical incident itself, but through the way that critical incident is observed and how meaning is created by the individual officer towards that critical incident. That is where the key issue is that I believe needs to be focused on. And what I've identified is that there's two primary areas create the meaning in regards to how I'm experiencing my environment. And so when we put stress on top of experiencing a critical incident, what I find is the two main areas that come to my awareness of this is one, the way an officer's individual personality and temperament is interpreting the experience. And then second, that officer's past experience in childhood and all of their previous engagements in life that have created issues that may be what we might term triggers are understood and processed. It's the past experiences and it's the personality of the officer that create the filters for how that officer is experiencing a critical incident. Even before looking at breathwork or looking at any cool mind ninja tricks that we could use to help an officer deal with a critical incident, is to help that officer understand the way that they tend to process, period. So who are they? And to create a deeper sense of self-awareness, because if I'm able to do that, then I'm able to catch myself before things actually become an issue. Much like when we just talked about with the alcohol before, that level of self-awareness of being aware is like, well, where's my limit here? And am I using this alcohol to become something of a coping mechanism in a negative way? So too, if I can have a deeper understanding of how I tend to function under stress and what I tend to do, that can dramatically impact my ability to gain control over myself from a cognitive perspective, and then also from a physiological perspective with the way that my stresses interact with my environment. That to me is really key. So once again, past experiences and personality development really go a lot into being able to understand who I am and how I function. And you might go, well, that sounds great. How the hell are we supposed to teach that to an officer, right? That's part of what the training that I do, the tactical resilience training, we do that specifically over either a half day or a full day training. I actually dig into this and present it in a way that's palatable for the average officer to be able to understand the concepts, grab a hold of and apply them to their life. That's the first thing. So I think being able to have a deeper understanding of those things go a long way into be able to manage my stress levels. And in regards to actually managing the stress levels, man, there's some absolutely incredible resources that are out here and available now, especially as technology is increasing. One in particular, which I'll just briefly share about that is in current development is with a company called Invi Mind Health, INVI. And this was developed by a Navy SEAL by the name of Jonathan Wilson. What it does, it actually takes the biometrics of an officer, like you mentioned a Whoop earlier on, or the Aura Ring, or maybe a Garmin watch or an Apple Watch, where they read the biometrics, and through machine learning and AI, Johnny and his company have been able to develop an incredible tool and resource that helps monitor and find a baseline for that officer's physiological responses with stress. It monitors the sleeping, it monitors the heart rate variability, and through machine learning, it's able to identify where that officer's baseline averages are, and it accumulates in what they call a mind score, like a mind health score. And whenever that mind health score deviates, it's able to alert what they call a swim buddy, or you might assign another officer or maybe your shift supervisor, let's say, to be able to help monitor where you are. And the moment that mind health score deviates from its average, it's able to alert a buddy to say, hey, you need to check in on Officer Neil here, because it looks like, according to his biometrics, that his scores are off. And the reason why that's really powerful to me is that too often we just lie. Like when someone says, how you doing? What do we say? Good.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that's the truth or not is another thing, but that's what we do because we don't want to inconvenience anyone with our struggles. But the thing with this great technology is that it basically measures your biometrics, and your biometrics don't lie. So you might verbalize you're doing well, but it can identify your stresses. It actually can also identify how, for example, we talked about alcohol before. It identifies how alcohol can dramatically impact your mental health and your physiological health. There's phenomenal tools. It's still being developed out, but in about 2 weeks, I'm actually heading out to Los Angeles. They're meeting with the LAPD SWAT and also with the DEA SWAT team out there. I've done some work with those guys and actually introduced them to Invi to do a workshop with their teams, and also the LAFD as well, on this stress management techniques and whatnot that Invi's developed. So I think that's a massive tool that's getting ready to be available nationwide to all of our agencies. So that's one great tool and resource. There's definitely some other things like mindfulness and meditation and whatnot, and there's certainly better experts than me that can speak into this. But really, at the end of the day, what that's doing to me is creating the opportunity to elevate a level of self-awareness. That's not just some hippie term. I think it's an important one for officers, and especially on an executive level, is to really look at the way in which we're creating and fostering an environment of awareness to wellness and to mental health through creating opportunities to be able to provide our officers with tools and resources. And so there's plenty of awesome ones out there. Envy, for example, is just one example of an incredible tool that I think can be really a game changer for agencies.
Well, thank you so much. I think our listeners have some tangible takeaways, and we'll have to bring you back for a part 2 to talk a little bit more about these things. But ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Phil talking about tactical resiliency, helping us prepare the mind to win the fight. So before we go, we have a few minutes. Just tell people where they can find you, Dr. Phil, so people can reach out and learn more about you, or even hire you to be a coach for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the easiest way is through our website, tacpre.com. So that's TACPRE.com. And there's plenty of information there about the Tactical Resilience Training Program for agencies, and then also our nonprofit as well, which basically helps fund our ability to provide these services and tools to agencies if they don't have line item budgets for it. So there's no reason at all that we can't get this info out there. So yeah, absolutely. Any way I can serve any of the listeners in regards to their agencies, please reach out. It's tacpre.com. And I'd love to get the opportunity to come share with the listeners and their agencies.
Thank you so much. Remember, brothers and sisters, that it's okay to be okay. It's okay to be okay. It's okay to take care of yourself and leave this profession and have a great retirement. Remember, if you're listening, that you're always wanted, needed, and appreciated. Remember, listeners, that one person can change the world. Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Dr. Phil Baquie, they can change the world. Don't think you can't go back to your organization and change the culture of wellness in your organization. Until next time, stay safe, healthy, and resilient, and God bless.
We extend our gratitude to Chief Neil Gang and Dr. Phil Baquie for leading us through this exploration of wellness and leadership for our extraordinary first responders. This is Shalyn Finstad signing off on behalf of Techna Innovations and the Sixth Pillar Podcast. Be safe, and thank you for joining us.